The darkness is not complete. It never is, not here by the coast where the Atlantic refuses to let the world sleep in perfect black. Even at this hour, when the night should still hold dominion, there is that pale gray creeping across the ceiling above me. Pre-dawn light, tentative and cold, spilling through unfamiliar windows onto unfamiliar floorboards. I lie perfectly still, my eyes tracing the way the light pools and stretches, finding the grain in wood I have never seen before today. The boards are older than the ones in my house, scarred and uneven, painted white so many times that the edges have gone soft. There is something honest about them that makes my chest tighten. Behind me, I feel the steady rhythm of another man's breathing, warm against the back of my neck, so close I can feel the slight movement of air with each exhale. His arm rests across my side, not possessive, not urgent, just there. The weight of it is both nothing and everything. We are not touching the way lovers touch in movies, all desperate hands and tangled limbs. We are simply existing in the same small space, our bodies curved around each other like we have been doing this for years instead of hours. The moment hums with something I cannot name, something that sits heavy in my throat and makes it hard to breathe properly. It is beautiful and terrible all at once, this quiet intimacy that feels both inevitable and impossible. I know what I should do. I have always known what I should do. Rise carefully so as not to wake him. Find my clothes in the gray light. Dress quietly. Leave before the sun climbs high enough for neighbors to see me walking to my car. Leave before the world remembers I am not the sort of man who does this. I am Nathaniel Hayes. I teach American history to teenagers who care more about their phones than the Revolutionary War. I have been married to Clara for 18 years. We have a daughter who will graduate next spring and leave for college, and I have spent 46 years building a life that makes sense to everyone who knows me. Responsible, predictable, safe. But lying here, feeling the warmth of Julian's breath on my skin, all of that feels like a story I once read about someone else. The floorboards creak softly beneath us as the old cottage settles, and I think about how easy it would be to slip away. How simple it would be to pretend this never happened, to go home and make coffee and ask Clara about her day, and let this morning dissolve into the kind of memory that feels more like a dream after enough time passes. I should move. I know I should move. But then his voice comes from the quiet behind me, low and thick with sleep, and he says just one word. Stay. Something breaks open in my chest. Not breaks like shattering, but breaks like dawn, like the moment when darkness finally gives way to light. I flinch as though he has reached inside me and touched something I forgot was there. My breath catches and holds, and for several heartbeats I cannot remember how to exhale. I do not answer him. I cannot answer him, because anything I say will make this real in a way I am not sure I can survive. Instead, I close my eyes and try to disappear into the stillness, as if staying perfectly motionless could suspend this moment forever, could keep me from having to choose between the life I have built and the life I never let myself imagine. His breathing shifts slightly, and I wonder if he is awake now, waiting for my response. I wonder if he can feel the way my heart is racing, if he knows that his single word has undone something in me that took decades to carefully construct. The silence stretches between us, filled with everything I cannot say. I love my wife. I love my daughter. I have built a good life, a decent life, the kind of life that makes sense to everyone who knows me. But I also know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that I have never felt as much like myself as I do in this small cottage bedroom, listening to Julian breathe beside me. 3 months ago, I had never heard his name. Now the sound of it in my own mind feels like coming home to a place I never knew I was searching for. The light continues to creep across the ceiling above us, patient and relentless. Somewhere in town, Clara is probably starting the coffee, the way she is every morning for 18 years. Hannah is sleeping in her childhood bedroom, dreaming of college and the future that awaits her. The life I built is still there, still waiting for me to return and pretend that nothing has changed. Soon it will be morning, truly morning, and I will have to decide who I am going to be when I walk out of this room. But for now, for these last few minutes before the world wakes up and remembers how to judge, I lie here in the space between sleeping and waking, between staying and leaving, between the man I have always been and the man I might still become. The floorboards hold our secret. The walls keep our silence. And somewhere between Julian's quiet breathing and the growing light, I feel the fault lines of my carefully ordered life beginning to shift. To understand what happened in that cottage bedroom, you have to know what my life looked like before Julian Ward appeared in it. You have to see the careful architecture of routine I had spent decades building, brick by brick, until it felt solid enough to call home. I was 46 years old, a high school history teacher in a modest coastal town in New England where the houses lean into the salt wind and everyone knows your name at the post office. Clara and I lived in a weathered colonial that we bought 12 years earlier when Hannah was 6 and still believed I could fix anything that broke. The house had good bones, the realtor had said, though I learned over the years that good bones still require constant attention. Our mornings followed the same gentle choreography they had for years. The scrape of ceramic coffee mugs against the granite counter, the soft rustle of Clara turning newspaper pages, the sound of Hannah's footsteps overhead as she prepared for another day of her senior year, each one bringing her closer to the college acceptance letters that would change everything. Clara would ask if I remembered to grade the essays from my American Revolution unit. I would ask if she had planned the library's autumn reading program. We spoke in the shorthand of long marriage, efficient and polite, covering all the necessary ground without ever venturing into territory that might require us to actually see each other. Clara was a good woman. Is a good woman, I should say, though I suppose from her perspective I forfeited the right to speak about her in the present tense long ago. She worked as the head librarian at our small-town library, a job that suited her perfectly. She had always been drawn to quiet spaces, to the careful organization of knowledge, to helping people find exactly what they were looking for. She was warm with the patrons, especially the elderly ones who came in more for company than books, and she remembered every child's favorite series. At home, she moved through our rooms with the same gentle efficiency, watering plants, sorting mail, maintaining the careful order that kept our life running smoothly. Our marriage was not hostile. That would have been easier to name, easier to address. Instead, it was something harder to identify and impossible to fix. Emptied. That is the word that comes closest. Like a house where all the furniture remains in place, but the people who once gave it meaning have somehow become strangers sharing the same space. We were kind to each other. We asked about each other's days. We divided household responsibilities fairly and never fought about money or whose turn it was to take out the trash. But somewhere along the way, we had stopped seeing each other as mysteries worth solving. Hannah was the bright center of our universe, the thing that made our careful politeness feel worthwhile. She was 17, sharp and funny, and completely unaware that her parents had been slowly drifting apart for years. She had inherited Clara's love of books and my stubborn streak, and she was planning to study journalism at colleges we could barely afford but would somehow manage to pay for. Watching her prepare to leave felt like watching someone pack away the best parts of our life together. My days followed the rhythm of tides, predictable and steady. Faculty meetings where we discussed standardized test scores and budget cuts, the endless bureaucracy that slowly drained the joy from teaching. Classroom hours spent trying to make the Revolutionary War feel relevant to teenagers who live their lives on screens, though occasionally one of them would ask a question that reminded me why I had chosen this profession. There was something about history that had always moved me, the way individual choices could ripple forward across decades, how ordinary people found themselves at the center of extraordinary moments without ever knowing how their stories would end. Lunch duty in the cafeteria meant listening to the constant buzz of adolescent drama, the same social hierarchies and heartbreaks that had existed when I was their age, just played out now across different platforms. After school, I would grade papers at the kitchen table while Clara prepared dinner, the sound of her knife against the cutting board a gentle percussion to my red pen scratching across student essays about Valley Forge. Some evenings, Hannah would join me at the table with her own homework, and I would look up from a particularly creative interpretation of the Boston Tea Party to find her studying for her AP Literature exam. her brow furrowed in concentration that reminded me so much of Clara at that age it made my chest ache. Evenings meant quiet dinners where Hannah told us about her classes and her friends, her voice filling the spaces Clara and I no longer knew how to occupy. After she went upstairs to do homework, Clara and I would watch television or read, sharing the sofa but existing in separate worlds. Sunday mornings meant church, where we sat in the same pew we had claimed 15 years ago, singing hymns and listening to sermons about love and forgiveness while carefully not looking at each other during the parts about marriage being a sacred covenant. But there were moments when something else would surface, moments that caught me off guard with their intensity. Driving home from school in the late afternoon, I would sometimes find myself taking the long way, the route that curved along the shoreline where the Atlantic stretched endlessly toward a horizon I could never quite reach. I would park at the overlook and sit in my car, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, feeling something restless and nameless pressing against my ribs like a caged bird. The ocean was different every day, but somehow always the same, and I envied its honesty, the way it never pretended to be anything other than what it was. Or standing in my backyard after mowing the lawn, the smell of cut grass and salt air mixing in the evening light, I would feel suddenly hollow, as if I were looking at my life from a great distance and wondering how I had ended up in this particular place, living this particular story. The house behind me would glow warm with lamplight, Clara moving past the kitchen window, Hannah's music drifting down from her bedroom, and I would think that this should be enough. This was everything I had ever said I wanted. But there was something missing, something I could not name because naming it would mean admitting it existed. Sometimes, lying awake next to Clara while she slept, I would listen to the sound of her breathing and remember what it felt like in the early years when the space between us hummed with possibility. We had been happy once, genuinely happy, before life settled into its patterns, and we became characters in a story we had stopped actively writing. I wondered if she felt it too, this gentle drift toward separate shores, or if contentment came more easily to her than it did to me. I had buried that restlessness so deep and for so long that I no longer had words for it. It was easier to focus on the things that needed doing, the papers that needed grading, the gutters that needed cleaning, the careful maintenance of a life that looked, from the outside, exactly like what it was supposed to be. I was a good teacher, a good husband, a good father. I paid my taxes and volunteered at the school fundraisers and showed up where I was expected to show up when I was expected to be there. If there was something else I wanted, something I had never let myself imagine, it was buried so far beneath the surface that I could almost convince myself it did not exist. Until the night I pulled over to help a stranger on a rain-soaked road, and everything I thought I knew about myself began to shift like sand beneath my feet. Until I met Julian Ward and discovered that the restlessness I had carried for so long finally had a name. It was a late summer storm that brought Julian Ward into my life, the kind that rolls in from the Atlantic without warning and turns the coastal road into a tunnel of driving rain. I was heading home from a faculty meeting that had run longer than usual, the kind where we spent 2 hours discussing things that could have been covered in an email. The windshield wipers struggled against the downpour, and I leaned forward in my seat, trying to see beyond the next curve in the road. That was when I spotted the car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the gray curtain of rain. A small sedan, older model, the kind that probably should not have been out in weather like this. I slowed down, more out of curiosity than any real intention to help. We got tourists through here sometimes, people who underestimated how quickly the weather could turn along the coast. As I drew closer, I could see someone inside the car, a figure hunched over what looked like a large case. The person was trying to shield something from the rain that was apparently getting in through a window or door that would not close properly. Without really thinking about it, I pulled over behind them and turned on my own hazards. I am not typically the sort of person who stops for strangers. Clara had always been the one more likely to offer help to someone in need, while I preferred to assume that other people had their situations well in hand. But something about the scene made me reach for my umbrella and step out into the storm. The rain hit me immediately, cold and sharp, soaking through my jacket before I had taken 3 steps. I approached the driver's side of the car and tapped on the window. The person inside looked up, and I found myself staring at a man I had never seen before, someone who was clearly not from around here. He was younger than me by maybe 10 years, with dark hair that was already soaked and plastered to his forehead. But what struck me most was his expression when he saw me. No panic, no frustration at being stranded, just a kind of quiet steadiness that seemed entirely out of place given the circumstances. He rolled down the window, which apparently worked better than whatever had been letting the rain in elsewhere. "I have to help you," I said, though I am not sure why those were the first words that came out of my mouth. He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that seemed to acknowledge something I had not realized I was offering. "I would appreciate that," he said. His voice was calm, unhurried, as if we were meeting at a coffee shop instead of on the side of a storm-battered road. "I am Julian Ward, and this is not exactly how I plan to spend my evening." "Nathaniel Hayes," I told him. "Let me give you a ride wherever you need to go." He gestured to the case he had been protecting. It was a guitar case, I realized, worn leather that had probably seen a lot of travel. "I cannot leave this," he said, "if that is all right." "Of course," I said, though I was not sure why I was being so accommodating to a complete stranger. "We can put it in my back seat." The transfer from his car to mine was accomplished quickly, both of us getting even more soaked in the process. Julian moved with an easy efficiency, as if unexpected storms were just part of life rather than something to be frustrated by. Once we were both inside my car, heater running and windows slowly defogging, I asked where he was staying. "There is a small cottage rental near the harbor," he said. "Maple Street, I think. My sister arranged it for me." I knew the cottage he meant. An old place that had been converted into a rental property, the kind where tourists stayed when they wanted something more authentic than the chain hotel out by the highway. It was only about 10 minutes away, but in this weather it felt much longer. We drove in comfortable silence for the first few minutes, the rain drumming steadily on the roof of my car. Julian sat quietly beside me, not fidgeting or making awkward conversation the way most people would have. There was something peaceful about his presence that I could not quite identify. "So you are visiting your sister," I said eventually, more to fill the silence than because I needed to know. "She lives here year-round now," he said. "Moved up from Boston last spring. Says she loves the quiet, though I think she mostly loves being close to the ocean. I am a musician, so I travel a lot, but I try to visit when I can." "What kind of music do you play?" "Folk, mostly. Some indie rock. The kind of thing that works better in small venues than big ones." He paused, looking out at the rain. "Your town seems like the sort of place where people might actually listen." There was something in the way he said it that made me glance over at him. He was looking out the passenger window, but I had the sense that he was seeing something beyond the storm, something that had nothing to do with weather or unfamiliar roads. When we reached the cottage, I helped him carry his guitar case to the front door. The rain had not let up, and we were both soaked through by the time we reached the small covered porch. Julian fumbled with the keys for a moment, then got the door open. "Thank you," he said, turning to face me. The light from inside the cottage fell across his face, and he smiled again, the same unhurried smile from the car. "I really appreciate this. Not everyone would have stopped." "It was nothing," I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew that was not quite true. Something about the encounter felt significant in a way I could not explain. "Maybe I will see you around town," he said. "If you know any good places to play, I would be grateful for the recommendation." I told him about the pier, how sometimes local musicians played there in the evenings when the weather was good. He nodded, as if filing the information away for later use. I drove home through the continuing storm, but my mind was not on the rain or the road. Instead, I found myself thinking about Julian Ward, about the quiet way he had handled being stranded, about the smile that had seemed to linger just a moment longer than politeness required. I told myself it was just the satisfaction of helping someone in need, the kind of good deed that makes you feel briefly better about the world. But 3 days later, when Clara mentioned casually over dinner that a musician had come into the library looking for books about local history, my attention sharpened immediately. "Nice young man," she said, cutting into her chicken. Julian something. Said he was visiting his sister and wanted to learn more about the area. I helped him find some books about the maritime history, the old lighthouse records, that sort of thing. Julian Ward, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. That sounds right. Clara looked up at me. Do you know him? I gave him a ride the other night when his car broke down in the storm, I said. Seemed like a decent guy. Clara nodded and went back to her dinner, the conversation already forgotten. But I found myself thinking about Julian in the library, looking through books about our town's history, and I wondered what he was hoping to find. 2 evenings later, I found myself walking down to the pier after dinner. I told Clara I needed some air, which was true enough, though I did not mention that I was hoping to see if Julian had taken my advice about playing there. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and pink, and the evening was calm after several days of unsettled weather. That was when I heard the guitar. It was coming from the far end of the pier, where someone had set up on one of the benches that faced the harbor. The music was soft, contemplative, the kind of thing you might play for yourself rather than an audience. As I got closer, I could see that it was indeed Julian, his guitar case open beside him but empty of any donations. He was not busking. He was just playing because he wanted to. I stood at the edge of hearing for several minutes, not wanting to interrupt. The music was beautiful, melancholy but not sad, like a conversation with the ocean that only he could hear. When the song ended, he looked up and saw me standing there. "Nathaniel," he said, as if he had been expecting me. "How do you like the acoustics?" I walked over to where he was sitting. "They suit you," I said. "Mind if I sit?" He gestured to the other end of the bench, and I settled beside him. From here, we could see across the harbor to where the lights were just beginning to come on in the houses scattered along the far shore. "Clara mentioned you came by the library," I said. "Your wife seems very knowledgeable. She helped me find some fascinating material about this place. Did you know there used to be a shipbuilding operation right here where we are sitting?" "I did not know that," I said, though I realized I should have. I teach history, but somehow the history of my own town had always seemed less interesting than the larger stories I told my students. "There is something about places like this," Julian said, still looking out at the water. "Old coastal towns. They have so many layers, so many stories. You can feel the weight of all the people who came before." We talked for over an hour about the town's history, about the way music could capture the feeling of a place, about why certain songs never seemed to lose their power to move us. Julian was an easy person to talk to, genuinely curious about things I had never thought to examine closely. When I finally stood to leave, the sky had darkened to deep purple and the first stars were appearing. As I walked back toward my car, I realized something had shifted in me during that conversation. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I had felt truly seen by another person, as if Julian had been listening not just to my words, but to something deeper, something I had not even known I was saying. I drove home with that feeling sitting warm in my chest, not yet understanding what it meant, but knowing that whatever was happening, there would be no going back to not knowing Julian Ward. What happened next unfolded so gradually that I could almost convince myself it was coincidence. The way you might run into the same person at the grocery store 3 times in 1 week and chalk it up to similar schedules rather than admit you had started shopping at different times, hoping to see them again. The first few encounters felt entirely accidental. I would be picking up milk and bread at the small market downtown when I would spot Julian in the produce section, carefully selecting apples as if each one required serious consideration. He would look up, smile that unhurried smile, and we would end up talking by the checkout line about whether the local honey was worth the extra cost or if the weather was finally settling into autumn. Then there was the morning I stopped by the library to return a book Clara had asked me to drop off, and I found Julian sitting in the far corner of the reading room, surrounded by stacks of local history books and old maritime records. The morning light slanted through the tall windows and caught the concentration on his face as he took notes in a small leather journal. When he noticed me, he gestured me over as if we were old friends. "Finding anything interesting?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him. "More than I expected," he said. "Did you know this town used to be a major stopping point for ships traveling between Boston and the maritime provinces?" There are records here of captains who brought musicians with them, traveling performers who would play in the taverns while their ships were being resupplied. I had not known that, and listening to him talk about it, I realized how little I actually knew about the place where I had lived for over a decade. Julian had a way of making history feel immediate, personal, as if those long-dead sea captains and traveling musicians were still present somehow, their stories woven into the fabric of streets I walked every day. We ended up having coffee at the small table in the library's reading alcove, talking in low voices about the way places hold memory, about how music travels from one generation to the next, carrying pieces of the people who played it before. Julian asked questions I was not used to answering, not the surface-level inquiries about my job or the weather, but deeper things. What drew me to teaching history? What was it like to watch Hannah growing up in the same town where I worked? Did I ever feel like I was living inside someone else's story? That last question caught me off guard. I found myself pausing longer than I should have, coffee growing cold in my hands while I searched for an answer that felt honest. Sometimes, I said finally, though I think that might be true for most people. We make these plans when we are young, and then years later we look around and wonder how we ended up here instead of wherever we thought we were going. But this is a good life, Julian said, and it was not quite a question. It is, I said. It is a good life. But as I spoke the words, they felt oddly hollow, as if I were trying to convince myself as much as him. Julian nodded, but something in his expression suggested he had heard what I had not quite said. He changed the subject then, asking about the lighthouse that was visible from the library windows, and the moment passed. But I carried his question with me for days afterward, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone found on the beach. Our meetings became more frequent after that, though they still maintained the pretense of accident. I would find myself taking longer walks in the evening, routes that happened to pass near the pier where Julian often played. Sometimes he would be there, sometimes not, but when he was, he would wave me over as if my appearance was the most natural thing in the world. We started walking together along the shoreline during those long September evenings when the light seemed to stretch on forever. Julian was unhurried in a way that unnerved me. He never seemed to be checking the time or thinking about somewhere else he needed to be. He listened when I talked, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He asked follow-up questions that suggested he had been paying attention to things I had mentioned weeks earlier. He wanted to know about the books I assigned to my students, whether I thought teenagers today had a different relationship to history than previous generations. He asked about the house Clara and I lived in, how we had chosen it, what it was like to put down roots in a place. But he also asked stranger questions, more personal ones. What did I do when I could not sleep? What was my favorite time of day? If I could go back and tell my 20-year-old self one thing, what would it be? I found myself answering him, sharing things I had not talked about with anyone in years. The way I sometimes stood at my bedroom window at 3 in the morning, looking out at the street and wondering about the lives being lived behind all those dark windows. How I loved the hour just before dawn when the world felt suspended between night and day. The regret I carried about not traveling more when I was younger, not taking chances that had seemed too risky at the time. Julian shared pieces of his own story in return. He had grown up in Vermont, in a family that moved frequently for his father's work. Music had been his constant companion, the thing that traveled with him from place to place. He had lived in Nashville for a while, trying to make it as a songwriter, but found he preferred smaller venues, more intimate connections with his audience. He had never married, never settled anywhere for more than a year or two at a time, until his sister convinced him to come here for an extended visit. There was something about the way he talked about his nomadic life that fascinated me. He spoke of it not with regret, but with a kind of wonder, as if each new place had taught him something essential about himself. I envied that freedom even as I could not imagine living that way, untethered from routine and responsibility. At home, I found myself distracted in ways I had not been before. Clara would ask me something twice before I realized she was speaking to me. I would catch myself staring out the kitchen window while grading papers, my red pen idle in my hand. During dinner conversations, my mind would wander to things Julian had said, questions he had asked that I was still trying to answer. Clara noticed, of course. She asked if I was feeling all right, if the stress of the new school year was getting to me. I told her I was fine, just tired, and she accepted that explanation because it was easier than pressing further. Hannah was absorbed in college applications and seemed oblivious to any changes in the household dynamic. But the truth was that something fundamental was shifting in me, and I did not yet have words for what it was. I started finding excuses to be downtown more often, stopping by the bookstore or the cafe, walking routes that might bring me near the pier. I told myself I was just enjoying the crisp autumn air, the way the light was changing as the days grew shorter. Then came the evening when everything changed again. I had been walking along the harbor when the sky opened up in one of those sudden October rainstorms that blow in from the ocean without warning. I was still a good 15 minutes from my car when the first heavy drops began to fall. I started jogging toward the parking area, but Julian's voice called out behind me. "Nathaniel, over here." He was standing in the doorway of his cottage, which was closer than my car. The cottage I had driven him to that first night, though I had never been inside. He gestured for me to hurry, and I found myself running toward him through the rapidly intensifying rain. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me through the door. "You will be soaked if you try to make it to your car." I hesitated for just a moment on the threshold, some instinct warning me that crossing that doorway would mean something I was not ready to name. But the rain was coming down harder now, and Julian was holding the door open with an expression of genuine concern. I stepped inside. The cottage was smaller than I had imagined, but warm and comfortable in a way that felt immediately welcoming. Julian had made it his own during his weeks here, books stacked on the coffee table, his guitar leaning against the wall, photographs and postcards pinned to a small bulletin board. The space smelled like coffee and something else, something that I realized was simply Julian himself, a scent I had become familiar with during our walks, but had never noticed consciously before. "Let me get you a towel," he said, "and I will make tea. This storm looks like it might last a while." I accepted the towel gratefully and dried my hair while Julian moved around the small kitchen with easy familiarity. Through the windows, I could see the rain coming down in sheets, turning the harbor gray and choppy. We were going to be here for a while. Julian brought 2 steaming mugs over to the small living area, and we settled on the floor with our backs against the couch, legs stretched out toward the coffee table. It felt oddly natural, as if we had done this dozens of times before. Our knees were almost touching, separated by perhaps an inch of space that seemed both insignificant and enormous. "This is nice," Julian said, gesturing toward the windows where the rain created an ever-changing pattern against the glass. "I love storms when you are somewhere safe and warm." I nodded, though I was finding it difficult to concentrate on the weather. Sitting this close to Julian, in the intimate space of his temporary home, I was intensely aware of his presence in a way that made my pulse quicken. The way he held his mug with both hands, the small scar on his left wrist that I had never noticed before, the fact that neither of us had moved to create more space between us. We talked as the storm raged outside, our conversation ranging from books we had loved as children to places we hoped to travel someday. Julian told me about a song he was working on, inspired by the maritime history he had been researching. I found myself talking about Hannah, about how proud I was of her, but how much I would miss her when she left for college. "She is lucky to have you as a father," Julian said quietly. "The way you talk about her, you can tell how much you care." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely. There was an expression on his face I had not seen before, softer somehow, more vulnerable. "Did you ever want children?" I asked. "I thought I did, when I was younger," he said. "But my life has not really been set up for that kind of stability. Maybe someday, if I ever figure out how to stay in one place long enough." "What would make you want to stay somewhere?" I asked, though I was not sure why the question felt so important. Julian was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his tea. When he looked up, his eyes met mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "The right reason," he said simply. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cottage, the world had narrowed to just the 2 of us, sitting close enough to touch, separated by a space that felt charged with possibility. I knew I should move, should create some distance, should make an excuse to leave as soon as the rain let up. But I also knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I did not want to move at all. In the weeks that followed that evening, I felt the careful borders of my life beginning to bend. Not breaking, not yet, but stretching in ways I had never allowed before. I could not yet admit to myself what they were bending toward, but I could feel the pressure building, the sense that something fundamental was about to give way. I was 46 years old, and for the first time in decades, I had no idea what came next. It happened on a night in mid-October when the air had turned sharp with the promise of winter, and the trees along the harbor were beginning to show their true colors. I had been spending more evenings at Julian's cottage, ostensibly waiting out weather or simply extending our conversations past the point where it made sense to stand on the pier talking. We had developed an easy rhythm of shared dinners, quiet music, the kind of companionship that felt both natural and impossibly charged. That particular evening, Julian had been working on a song inspired by one of the maritime stories he had found in the library archives. The melody was haunting, built around the tale of a ship captain who had disappeared during a winter storm, leaving behind only a journal full of letters he had never sent. Julian played it through several times, adjusting the chord progressions, asking for my thoughts on whether the bridge felt too melancholy or just melancholy enough. We had been talking for hours, our conversation moving from music to books to the way memory works, how certain moments become more real in retrospect than they felt when they were happening. The cottage felt warm and separate from the rest of the world, a pocket of space where time moved differently. Somehow we had ended up lying on Julian's bed, not sleeping but not quite awake either, existing in that suspended state that comes after deep conversation when words have given way to comfortable silence. We were at opposite ends of his small bed, our feet occasionally brushing against each other in a way that should have felt accidental, but had started to feel like a conversation of its own. The lamp beside the bed cast everything in soft golden light, and through the windows I could hear the distant sound of waves against the harbor seawall. Julian had been quiet for a while, and I thought he might have dozed off, but then he spoke. "Tell me about the first time you knew," he said quietly. "Knew what?" I asked, though something in his tone made my chest tighten. "The first time you knew you were different from what everyone expected you to be." The question hung in the air between us like a challenge and an invitation. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by the lamp, feeling something shift inside me that I had kept carefully locked away for decades. "I was 17, I said finally, not looking at him. "My senior year of high school. There was this boy in my English class, Michael Chun. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of person who always had something interesting to say when he bothered to speak at all." Julian said nothing, but I could feel his attention like a physical presence. We ended up paired together for a project on transcendentalist poetry, Thoreau and Emerson, all that searching for truth in nature. We spent weeks working together, meeting after school in the library, walking around Walden Pond on weekends to try to understand what those writers were really talking about. Michael had this way of seeing connections between things that I never would have noticed on my own. I paused, remembering the weight of that autumn, the way the light had felt different when Michael was there to share it. I started looking forward to our meetings more than anything else in my week. When he laughed at something I said, it felt like winning something important. When he got excited about an idea, and his whole face would light up, I could not look away. I told myself it was just friendship, that this was what it felt like to really connect with someone intellectually. "But you knew it was more than that," Julian said softly. "I knew," I said, "but I also knew I could never say it." This was 1995, in a small town where being different was not really an option. And Michael was not. He was not like me. He dated girls, talked about girls, seemed completely comfortable with the path that was laid out for him. "What happened?" "Nothing happened," I said. "That was the problem. We finished our project. We both got into good colleges. The last day of school, I almost told him. We were walking to the parking lot, and I had this moment where I thought maybe, if I was brave enough, I could say something that would let him know how I felt. But then his girlfriend appeared, and he kissed her goodbye, and I realized how foolish I had been to think there could ever be anything between us. I turned my head to look at Julian then, and found him watching me with an expression I could not quite read. I never told anyone that story, I said. Not Clara, not anyone. I buried it so deep I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. But you did not imagine it, Julian said. No, I said. I did not imagine it. There was a long pause then, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the careful architecture of my life trembling around the edges. Julian shifted on the bed, moving closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence before I felt his touch. When his hand came to rest lightly on my chest, directly over my heart, the air between us changed completely. Everything that had been building between us over the past months suddenly crystallized into this single moment of contact, skin against fabric against skin. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that I recognized because I had been carrying it myself for longer than I wanted to admit. Not pity for the story I had just told, but understanding. Not surprise at my confession, but recognition. Nathaniel, he said, and my name in his voice sounded different than it ever had before. Like he was saying it for the first time, or like he had been practicing how to say it exactly this way. I could not speak, could not move, could not do anything but lie there feeling the weight of his hand against my chest and knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Julian leaned closer, moving with the kind of careful intention that suggested he had already made his decision, that this was not impulse, but inevitability. When he kissed me, it was not rushed or desperate, but steady, certain, like someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment and knew that this was it. I froze at first, every muscle in my body going tense with decades of conditioning that told me this was wrong, impossible, not something that happened to people like me. But then something deeper took over, something that felt like recognition rather than rebellion, and I found myself kissing him back. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 29 years. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Julian kept his hand on my chest, and I could feel my heart racing beneath his palm. He was watching my face carefully, as if checking to make sure I was still with him, that I had not fled back into the careful distance I had spent so long maintaining. I am 46 years old, I said, though I was not sure why that felt like something he needed to know. I know, he said softly. I have been married for 18 years. I know that too. I have never done this before. Never even admitted to myself that I wanted to. Julian smiled then, the same unhurried smile I remembered from that first night in the rain, but softer now, more intimate. Neither of those things change how this feels, he said, and he was right. Whatever this was, whatever it meant for the life I had built and the person I had always believed myself to be, it felt more real than anything I had experienced in longer than I could remember. Lying there beside Julian, his hand still warm against my chest, I realized with a strange calm that there was no going back to not knowing this part of myself. I had spent decades constructing a careful life around the absence of this feeling, and now that I had finally felt it, I understood what had been missing all along. Not just desire, but recognition. Not just attraction, but the deep relief of finally seeing myself clearly reflected in someone else's eyes. The lamp cast golden shadows across Julian's face, and I reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of stubble beneath my fingertips. He leaned into the touch, closing his eyes for a moment, and I marveled at how simple this felt now that it was happening, how natural, despite everything I had been taught to believe about myself. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cottage and reminding us that the world beyond these walls continued to exist. Tomorrow I would have to return to my life as Nathaniel Hayes, high school history teacher, husband, father. But tonight, in this small room filled with golden light and the sound of Julian's breathing, I was someone I had never allowed myself to be before. I was myself, finally and completely, for perhaps the first time in my adult life. And terrifying as that realization was, it felt like coming home. What followed that October night was a kind of doubleness I had never experienced before, as if I were living two completely separate lives that somehow occupied the same body, the same days, the same careful routine I had maintained for years. There were the family dinners where I sat across from Clara and Hannah, asking about homework and weekend plans, passing the salt and commenting on the weather, all while feeling like I was watching someone who looked like me perform the role of husband and father. I became skilled at nodding at the right moments, at making the appropriate responses, even as my mind was miles away, replaying conversations with Julian or anticipating the moment when I could reasonably excuse myself and drive to his cottage. The affair, if that is what we were calling it, became a quiet, urgent tether that pulled me through each day. I would finish dinner, help Clara clear the dishes, wait for Hannah to disappear upstairs to her room, and then announce that I was going for a drive, needed some air, had to pick up something from the store that we did not actually need. The lies came easier than they should have, flowing out of me with a practiced casualness that should have bothered me more than it did. But lying next to Julian in the warm glow of his bedside lamp, our bodies fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had never known was incomplete, the guilt felt abstract, distant. This was the most honest I had ever been with another person, even as it required me to be dishonest with everyone else in my life. Julian never asked me to leave Clara, never pressured me to make declarations or promises about the future. But there were moments when I could see the question in his eyes, could feel it in the way he would hold me just a little longer before I had to get dressed and return to my other life. He was patient in a way that made my chest ache, understanding in a way that made me love him more and fear that love more deeply. November arrived with an early cold snap that turned the harbor gray and sent most of the tourists home for the season. Julian had been in town for almost 3 months now, longer than he had stayed anywhere in years, and I began to wonder how long his sister expected him to remain, how long he could justify this extended visit to himself. Clara started asking if I was feeling all right. The question would come at random moments, while I was grading papers at the kitchen table or getting ready for work in the morning. "You seem distant lately," she would say. "Distracted. Is everything okay at school?" I told her I was fine, just tired, maybe coming down with something. The lies tasted sharp in my mouth, but they were easier than the truth, which felt too large and dangerous to speak aloud. Clara would nod and return to whatever she was doing, accepting my explanations because questioning them further would require conversations neither of us seemed prepared to have. Then Hannah's college acceptance letter arrived. I came home from school one afternoon to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread open in front of her, her face glowing with excitement and relief. She had gotten into her first choice, a small liberal arts college in Vermont that specialized in journalism programs. Clara was standing behind her, one hand resting on Hannah's shoulder, both of them looking happier than I had seen them in months. "This is wonderful," I said, and meant it. But as I hugged Hannah and listened to her talk about course catalogs and dorm assignments, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Time was running out. Hannah would graduate in 6 months and leave for college in 8. The structure that had held our family together for so long was about to shift, and I had no idea what would be left when it did. That night, lying beside Julian after we had made love, I felt the weight of the future pressing down on me like a physical thing. Hannah would leave. Clara and I would be alone in that house, forced to confront whatever we had become without the buffer of our daughter's presence. And Julian, who had never committed to staying anywhere for long, would eventually move on to whatever came next in his nomadic life. Julian must have sensed my restlessness because he turned toward me in the dark, his hand finding mine beneath the sheets. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Hannah got her acceptance letter today," I said. "She is going to Vermont in the fall." "That is good news," Julian said. "You must be proud." "I am," I said. "But it also means everything is about to change." There was a long pause before Julian spoke again, and when he did, his voice was carefully neutral. "When will you stop leaving?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us like a weight. I had been expecting it, dreading it, knowing that eventually we would have to address the fundamental impossibility of what we were doing. But hearing it spoken aloud made something crack open inside my chest. "I do not know," I said, and the honesty of it felt like admitting defeat. Julian did not push, did not ask me to choose or make ultimatums about what he needed from me. He simply squeezed my hand and turned back to face the ceiling, but I could feel the shift in the air between us, the way hope and patience were slowly giving way to something more resigned. The next few weeks passed in a blur of increasing tension. Hannah was busy with college preparations and senior year activities. Clara seemed more focused on her work at the library, staying later in the evenings and bringing home projects that kept her occupied through dinner. I continued my careful routine of family dinners followed by drives to Julian's cottage, but the doubleness was becoming harder to maintain. Then, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Clara found the note. It was a small piece of paper, folded in half, with Julian's handwriting in blue ink. He had written it during one of our afternoons together, a fragment of lyrics he was working on, something about how certain kinds of love felt like finally learning to breathe properly. I had slipped it between the pages of a book I was reading, intending to return it to him, but somehow it had ended up coming home with me. Clara discovered it when she was tidying the living room, the paper falling out when she picked up the book from the coffee table. I was not there when it happened, was still at school finishing up a faculty meeting, but I could picture it perfectly when she told me later. The way she would have unfolded it, read the words written in handwriting she did not recognize, felt the careful intimacy of the language and known immediately that it was not meant for her. When I walked through the front door that evening, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the notes spread open in front of her, the same table where Hannah had shared her college acceptance letter just weeks before. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. Clara looked up when I entered, and I saw something in her expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not even hurt, exactly, but a kind of terrible clarity, as if pieces of a puzzle she had been unconsciously working on had finally fallen into place. "Nathaniel," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded formal, distant, like she was addressing a stranger. "Is there someone else?" The question was asked with such quiet dignity that it broke something inside me. No raised voice, no accusations, just an unbearable gentleness that made lying impossible. I stood there in my own kitchen, looking at my wife of 18 years, and realized that this was the moment that would shape the rest of my life. Everything that came after would flow from what I said next, how I chose to answer this question that she already knew the answer to. I could have lied, could have claimed the note was from a student, a colleague, something innocent that had been misunderstood. Clara might have believed me, or at least pretended to believe me, and we could have continued our careful dance around the truth for months or years longer. But looking at her sitting there, the note evidence of everything I had been hiding, I found that I could not add another lie to the collection I had already built. "Yes," I said quietly, "there is someone else." The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with the sound of everything we had built together shifting and settling into new configurations. Clara nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something she had already known but hoped was not true. "I see," she said. And then, after another pause, "How long?" "Since October," I said. She nodded again, her fingers smoothing the edges of Julian's note with careful precision. "What happens now?" she asked, and I realized I had no answer for her, no plan beyond the impossible hope that somehow I could keep living this double life indefinitely. "I do not know," I said, and this time the words felt like the first honest thing I had said to her in months. Clara stood up then, leaving the note on the table between us like evidence in a case that had already been decided. "I think," she said quietly, "that you need to figure that out." She walked past me toward the stairs, pausing only to add, without looking back, "Hannah does not need to know about this yet. Not until you know what you want to tell her." I stood alone in the kitchen, looking at Julian's note lying open on the table, and felt the careful architecture of my life finally, irrevocably, begin to collapse around me. The apartment above the hardware store was not much to look at, but it had large windows that faced the harbor and came furnished with the basics I needed to start over. 2 rooms and a small kitchen, the kind of place designed for temporary living that somehow felt more like home than the house I had shared with Clara for 12 years. I moved there 3 days after Thanksgiving, after a conversation with Clara that was conducted entirely in practical terms. Division of belongings, custody arrangements for Hannah, how to explain to friends and family that our marriage was ending. We spoke like negotiators representing different countries, polite and careful, avoiding any territory that might lead to territory that might require us to acknowledge the emotional wreckage we were navigating around. Clara kept the house, which made sense since Hannah would be there until graduation. I took my books, some clothes, a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to my grandfather. The rest could be replaced or did not matter enough to fight over. What surprised me was how little I actually needed, how much of what I had accumulated over the years felt like someone else's belongings when it came time to pack. Hannah took the separation better than I had expected, though I could see the effort it cost her to maintain her composure. She visited the apartment twice during that first month, sitting on my secondhand couch and making conversation about school and her college plans while we both pretended that everything was normal. She never asked directly about why I had left, though I could see the question in her eyes sometimes. The closest we came to talking about it was during her second visit, when she was helping me hang pictures on the bare walls. "Dad," she said, not looking at me while she held a frame steady, "are you happier now?" The question caught me off guard, both for its directness and for the fact that I had not really considered happiness as a factor in any of this. I had been thinking in terms of honesty, authenticity, the impossibility of continuing to live divided. But happiness seemed like something different, something I was not sure I had a right to claim. "I think so," I said finally. "It is complicated, but yes, I think I am." She nodded and went back to adjusting the picture frame, and we never spoke about it again. But something in her posture relaxed after that. As if she had been carrying a worry, she could finally set down. I saw Clara only once during those first few weeks, passing her on Main Street as she left the post office. Our eyes met for a moment, and I started to raise my hand in greeting, but she looked away and continued walking as if I were a stranger. The coldness of it stung more than I had expected, though I understood it. I had chosen Julian over the life we had built together. There was no version of that choice that would not feel like betrayal to her. Julian and I did not immediately move in together, though he spent most nights at my apartment. His cottage rental ran through the end of January, and somehow the question of what came next remained unspoken between us. I had made my choice, but that did not automatically mean he had made his. For someone who had spent years moving from place to place, staying meant something different than it did for someone like me. Some evenings he still played at the pier, his guitar case open beside him in the gathering dusk. Sometimes I would join him there, sitting on the bench while he worked through new songs or revisited old ones. Other times I would stay home, giving him space to be alone with his music, to remember who he was outside of whatever we were becoming together. The town was small enough that people noticed, of course. I caught conversations stopping when I entered the grocery store, saw the way certain neighbors found reasons to cross the street rather than walk past me. But there were surprises too. Tom Bradley, who taught chemistry at the high school, made a point of sitting with me at lunch and talking about normal things as if nothing had changed. Mrs. Chun from the library, who had known me for years, smiled and asked how I was settling into my new place. Winter came early that year, and by February the harbor was edged with ice that caught the morning light like broken glass. I learned to cook simple meals in my small kitchen, to do laundry in the basement of the hardware store, to live alone in a way I had not done since college. There was something both terrifying and liberating about it, the way silence could expand to fill all the spaces that had once been occupied by family conversation. Julian and I talked about the future in careful increments. He had been offered some recording work in Nashville, session musician jobs that would pay well, but require him to be away for months at a time. There was also the possibility of staying, of finding a way to make music here, though it would mean giving up the nomadic life that had defined him for so long. I told him I would understand if he needed to leave, that I had no right to ask him to change his entire life for something as uncertain as what we had together. But I also told him, finally, that I loved him, and that if he wanted to stay, I would like nothing more than to figure out what that might look like. Spring, when it finally arrived, felt like a promise of something new rather than just the return of something familiar. Hannah graduated in June, and I watched from the audience as she walked across the stage, proud and heartbroken in equal measure. Clara sat 3 rows ahead of me, and though we did not speak, I saw her wipe away tears during Hannah's valedictorian speech. Julian decided to stay. Not forever, he was careful to point out, but for now, to see what could grow between us given time and space and the kind of honesty that had brought us together in the first place. He found a small house to rent year-round, close enough to the harbor that he could still play at the pier when the mood struck him, far enough from my apartment that we each maintained our own space while learning how to share our lives. And now, 2 years later, I wake sometimes before dawn and find myself in a place I never could have imagined when I was lying in that cottage bedroom, listening to Julian whisper the word stay. The apartment above the hardware store has become home in a way that surprises me with its completeness. The windows still face the harbor, and I can still hear the sound of waves against the seawall in the early morning quiet. This morning, Julian is here beside me, his breathing deep and steady in the gray light that spills across my ceiling. There is no whisper asking me to stay, no moment of choice between one life and another. There is only the steady rhythm of his presence, the warmth of his body next to mine, and the profound stillness of finally knowing exactly where I belong. I am 51 years old, and I have learned that some stories do not end so much as they settle into their true shape. This is mine, finally, honestly told. The careful architecture of my old life has given way to something smaller but more authentic, built around the simple truth of who I am and who I love. The light continues to grow stronger, painting the walls of my small apartment in shades of possibility. Somewhere in town, life is beginning its daily rhythm. Hannah is probably getting ready for her senior year of college, 3 states away, but still calling me every Sunday to tell me about her classes, her internship at the local newspaper, the boy she has been seeing who makes her laugh. Clara has learned to say hello when we pass each other on the street, though our conversations remain brief and carefully neutral. Julian shifts beside me, his hand finding mine beneath the sheets, and I squeeze gently without opening my eyes. In a few hours, he will leave for a recording session in Boston, gone for 3 days to work with a band that wants his particular style of acoustic arrangement. I will miss him, but I am no longer afraid of his leaving because I know he will come back. This is what I have learned about love in the time since that October night when everything changed. It is not the desperate, secret thing I once thought it had to be. It is simply this, the quiet certainty of choosing the same person again and again, in small moments and large ones, until the choosing becomes as natural as breathing. Outside, the world is waking up to another day. But here, in this bed, in this light, in this life I have finally allowed myself to live, I am exactly where I am supposed to be.